Section Intro. Free our people. Independence is being able to control our own lives and make our own choices. Before the 1980s, many disabled people had very little, if any, choice about where or how they lived. Disabled people who needed support had to rely on family or live in a hospital or residential institution. For many, the experience of living in these institutions was oppressive. They found themselves isolated with little, if any, freedom. In the 1950s and 1960s, some residents began to challenge the way these institutions were run and started to explore ways to leave. Their experiences played an important role in the development of the independent living movement. By 1984, both Hampshire and Derbyshire had set up centres for independent living, CILs. They would help to establish a framework which would allow disabled people greater control over their lives. Despite this, many disabled people still don't have the same control or opportunities as non-disabled people. This is due to inadequate support and services and the failure to listen to disabled people's opinions. There are further complex issues surrounding meeting the needs of disabled people who are not able to communicate. Independence and freedom to choose relates to every aspect of disabled people's lives, from education to defending the right to live. Photograph of Paul Hunt meeting leprosy campaigner and social worker Professor T.N. Jagadisan, 1960. Paul Hunt spent his teenage years living on hospital chronic wards. These were populated by much older men or those who were dying. Determined to escape the oppressive confines of the hospital ward, Hunt lobbied for a move to the Lee Court, the first Leonard Cheshire residential home. He moved there in 1956 when he was 19. It was while at the Lee Court he and other residents began to campaign for greater independence in the home. Hunt's ideas and writings from this period were hugely influential on the development of the disabled people's movement. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. Lee Court Film Unit photograph, 1950s. In 1955, a group of disabled people made their first short film, At Home with the Lee Court. After the success of the film, they established a core film crew of 4 disabled people. They called themselves the Lee Court Film Unit after the institution they were living in at the time. The unit went on to make a series of award-winning short films. Their work was groundbreaking as it showed disabled people representing themselves and trying to lead liberated and independent lives. The Lee Court Film Unit was made up of Barbara Beasley, later Barbara Lloyd Evans, Brian Lyne, Laurie Mauer and Neville Thomas. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. Photograph of Neville Thomas sitting outside the Lee Court, 1960. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. Photograph showing Neville Thomas with lighting, Laurie Mauer filming and Albert Baker painting, 1970. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. Photograph of John Regan and Barbara Lloyd Evans with Lord Snowdon at Shell House, 1981. Barbara Lloyd Evans was a key member of the Lee Court Film Unit, working as a scriptwriter and narrator. She actively campaigned for greater involvement of residents in running and management of the home. This photograph was taken when fellow resident Brian Lyne was given the Snowdon Award for his film It Could Happen to You. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. Photograph of Brian Lyne and Nick Dance filming in Basingstoke, 1979. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. At Home with Lee Court film, 1955. Audio described, 39 minutes, 5 seconds. The first Lee Court Film Unit film was made by Neville Thomas and captures daily life at Lee Court, a Leonard Cheshire home in Hampshire, as well as the demolition of the old Lee Court house. Courtesy of the Leonard Cheshire Archive. Photograph of Pamela Lafane, 1970s. This is a picture of Pamela Lafane, a prominent activist involved in the national campaign for the young chronically sick. After years of fighting the rigid hospital regime, Pamela became a journalist from her hospital bed and had an article published in the Guardian newspaper in 1966. Courtesy of Tony Baldwinson. Photograph of Doug Brown and Jean Turretts holding the Berkeley Centre for Independent Living CIL banner at Disabled People's Civil Rights Day, 1979. In the 1960s, a movement began promoting independent living at the University of California, Berkeley. This led to the first CIL being set up in 1972, which disabled people from the UK would later gain knowledge and encouragement from. Copyright Ken Stein photo, all rights reserved. Maggie and Ken Davis photograph, 1970s. In the 1970s, small groups of disabled people around the UK started looking at how they could leave residential institutions to live in their own homes. In 1976, a group of disabled people in Derbyshire, including Maggie and Ken Davis, successfully negotiated with a housing association for a purpose-built property containing flats at Grove Road, Derbyshire. The arrangement at Grove Road was unique, with non-disabled tenants supporting disabled tenants as part of the tenancy agreement, also receiving a small payment for this support from disabled people's benefits. This was a breakthrough in establishing a means for disabled people to leave residential institutions. Courtesy of Tony Baldwinson. Photograph of John Evans, 1981. John Evans, along with Philip Mason, Philip Scott, Tad Polkowski and Liz Briggs, started a scheme called Project 81 in 1979. They were living in the Lee Court, Leonard Cheshire residential home in Hampshire. They negotiated with the local authorities, paying for their places in Lee Court. After 3 years of discussion, it was finally agreed to give them the money to employ their own personal assistants so they could move out. Courtesy of John Evans. Hampshire Centre for Independent Living, HCIL, protest photograph, 1988. This photograph shows demonstrators from HCIL at a British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, BCODP, demonstration. In 1984, both Derbyshire Centre for Integrated Living and HCIL were set up, partly by people from Grove Road and Project 81. They were run and controlled by disabled people. Courtesy of Disabled People's Archive. Elephant and Castle protest photograph, 1988. In 1988, after much campaigning and lobbying by disabled people, the Independent Living Fund was set up. This money that disabled people could apply for to employ personal assistants came from central government. It made a significant difference to disabled people with higher support needs. Courtesy of Disabled People's Archive. British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, BCODP rally photograph, around 1988. 1989 brought the formation of 2 groups which would increase campaigning for independent living. The European Network on Independent Living was formed in Strasbourg when over 80 disabled people from 14 European countries met at the European Parliament. It is still going strong today. The British Council of Organisation of Disabled People, BCODP, set up their Independent Living Committee, which was tasked with campaigning for direct payments. Courtesy of Disabled People's Archive. Disabled People's Direct Action Network, DAN, Free Our People banner, 2022. This banner is from a DAN protest in March 2022, which highlighted the ongoing hostile environment facing disabled people. As part of this action, a wreath was laid in memory of the estimated 100,000 plus disabled people who died due to COVID-19. The banner is based on an original DAN banner made by Steve Graby in 2008 or 2009. It was based on a design by Mix Dennis Queen, and it was painted on an old window blind. On loan from Ernest Bow. Alf Morris's Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act pamphlet, 1970. Chelsea Labour Party National Campaign for the Chronically Sick leaflet, 1967. In the mid-1960s, the National Campaign for the Young Chronically Sick began to promote the need for an alternative to living in hospital or relying on the support of family. Campaign members provided evidence for a bill Alf Morris MP was promoting, which became the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, 1970. Fundamental Principles of Disability booklet, 1976. This booklet, published by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, has become a foundation text for the British disabled people's movement and the development of the social model of disability. The Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, was formed following Paul Hunt's letter to the Guardian newspaper in which he called for disabled people to form a consumer group to put forward the views of disabled people. On loan from Disabled People's Archive. Sourcebook Towards Independent Living, 1980s. The Hampshire Centre for Independent Living, HCIL, produced the first sourcebook towards independent living, a video and newsletters. They focused on promoting personal assistance and direct payments, which is the money given to disabled people to employ their own personal assistants. Similarly, Derbyshire CIL supported disabled people with information, peer support, housing, personal assistance, aids and adaptations, transport and environmental access. These became known as the Derbyshire 7 Basic Needs and have continued to be used by CILs and disabled people's organisations. On loan from Disabled People's Archive, Lorena Bulwer sampler, late 1800s. Lorena Bulwer was a British needleworker who created embroidered works whilst imprisoned in Great Yarmouth Workhouse during the late 1800s. These works can read as letters of protest or outrage at the conditions of her imprisonment in the workhouse. This small square sampler features hand-stitched words that are all in capital letters and 2 male figures appliqued in the centre. On loan from Norfolk Museum Service. Subsection Intro. Institutions are not solutions. Workhouses were set up to house poor people in the 19th century. They gradually became refuges for disabled or elderly people, and the residential homes and hospitals that replaced them often placed draconian restrictions on residents. Disabled people who were forced to live in residential care or hospitals felt that they had no choices and no rights to live how they wanted. Winterbourne is now the name of a national scandal. It was the name of a private hospital where staff abused and tortured learning disabled people who were residents there. This was not a one-off incident. Many such examples of institutional abuse have been uncovered before and since then. This section traces disabled people's resistance to and campaigns against institutional living and for justice. Dirge of the Brickmen, painting by Colin Hambrook, around 1990. Quotation. Dirge of the Brickmen was made over 30 years ago as one of a series of artworks about the brutality of the psychiatric system. The thugs in the painting characterise the psychological torture I received from an NHS psychiatrist. As a 10-year-old child, I was turned into the fall guy for the state-sanctioned murder of my mother. Labels and drugs have changed since that time, but the role of psychiatry remains the same. It continues to be the key that society uses to scapegoat those of us who struggle to fit into the narrow constraints of a capitalist society. Colin Hambrook, on loan from Ndaka. Psychiatric Oppression Document by Campaign Against Psychiatric Oppression, CAPO, 1985. The Mental Patients Union was a pivotal organisation which marked the beginning of the organised psychiatric survivors movement in Britain. The union evolved into People for the Rights of Mental Patients in Treatment, which eventually turned into CAPO in 1985 in order to free itself of the Mental Patients tag. Courtesy of Tony Baldwinson. Subsection Intro. A matter of life and death. From institutional neglect and abuse to eugenics, euthanasia, and the removal of welfare support, there have been numerous attempts to end or worsen disabled people's lives. More recently, disabled people have been targeted by the UK government with savage cuts that have threatened lives. In 2010, the coalition government slashed disability benefits as part of its austerity programme, which attempted to cut government borrowing. Disabled people were unlawfully and disproportionately affected by these cuts. Many disabled people could not afford to eat, and some died of suicide. Today, 1 in 3 disabled people live in poverty. Jodie and Mary demonstration photographs, 2000. The way we are viewed by healthcare professionals has a profound impact on the way in which society treats disabled people. So, their attitudes around embryo selection, genetic editing, abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide can consequently impact on how disabled people's lives are valued by society. This scrapbook documents the Mary and Jodie Equal Right to Life campaign I was involved in with other disabled activists and allies at St Mary's Hospital in Manchester in 2000, where the conjoined twins, called Jodie and Mary to protect their real identity, were awaiting an operation which will separate them and lead to the death of Mary. Simone Aspis, courtesy of Simone Aspis. Post-Winterbourne We Have Mendip placard, 2019. Reliable Witness placard, 2019. Mendip House was a care home for autistic people in Somerset, run by the National Autistic Society. It was closed in 2016 following allegations of abuse. On the 29th of March 2019, autistic campaigners protested in Manchester and London to highlight the injustices of the investigation. Staff at Mendip House stole thousands of pounds from residents, hurt them, humiliated them, treated them as actual animals, and even poisoned them. The home was shut down quick and staff were sacked. Exact sums were ordered to be repaid. You have probably heard in the press that the outcome of the Care Quality Commission court case was a measly fine of £4,000 to the company. No compensation for those harmed, no criminal prosecutions or penalty to the attackers. Extract from Justice for Mendip campaign manifesto, March 2019. On loan from Mix Dennis Queen and Pete Marshall. Disabled People's Protest Photographs, 3rd of October 2010. These photographs are from a demonstration held in Birmingham. It was the first mass protest against austerity cuts and their impact on disabled people. Courtesy of Alison Wilde. Broken Hearts for the DWP film by Dolly Sen, 2022. 13 minutes, 49 seconds. Multiple Film Festival winner Broken Hearts for the DWP is a short documentary on how the Department for Work and Pensions, DWP, is driving disabled people to starvation and suicide, and how disabled people are fighting back using art, love and rage. On loan from Dolly Sen. Photograph of disabled people against cuts, DPAC, Norfolk protest outside PIP Consultation Centre, 2016. Local groups around the UK, such as Norfolk pictured here, have protested against the cuts to disabled people which have come with the change from Disabled Living Allowance, DLA, to Personal Independence Payments, PIP. One example of this is the National Day of Action against PIP on the 13th of July 2016, with protests in many towns and cities. Many in the disabled people's movement believe the change from DLA to PIP is a brutal return to the medical model of disability, depriving many disabled people of the social support they need to participate on equal terms. Copyright of Roger Blackwell. Justice for Laughing Boy Quilt, 2014. The hashtag Justice for LB Quilt was created as a memorial to Connor Sparrowhawk, also known as Laughing Boy or LB. He drowned in an NHS hospital bath in 2013, aged 18. His inquest concluded neglect contributed to his death. The quilt was made by Janet Reed, Jean Draper, Margaret Taylor and Janice Firminger from hundreds of patches contributed by people who wanted to offer their support and promote the rights of people with learning disabilities. Contributors were drawn from across the UK and 7 other countries. It reflects the long history of textile art and craft used as a medium of political commentary, protest and resistance. On loan from Sarah Ryan. Connor Sparrowhawk photograph, around 2014. Courtesy of Sarah Ryan. Independent Living Skills for Young Disabled People leaflet, 1990s. Many disabled people's organisations realised that not all disabled young people had been socialised with independent living skills, as there had been an assumption that they would be living in institutions. This is an example of the attempts made to upskill and equip young disabled people. On loan from Disabled People's Archive. Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, GMCDP, Young Disabled People Moving On video cassette, 1990s. During 1993 to 1994, 40 young disabled people attended a course in independent living skills organised by GMCDP. This video, made by a team of young disabled people in collaboration with Community Arts Workshop, demonstrates some of the training techniques and philosophies used on the course, as well as acting as a general exploration of independent living issues for young disabled people. On loan from Sue Elsgood. Change books and leaflets, date unknown. Change is an organisation led by learning disabled people from Leeds. They are built on the belief that learning disabled people are the experts on the changes they need to lead a good quality of life. Change campaigns for many things, including equal access to employment, healthcare, and housing for learning disabled people. On loan from Change, part of the Advonet Group. Churchill Fellowship Award Medal and photograph of William Case receiving his Churchill Fellowship, 2011. William Case was the first person with cerebral palsy to receive a fellowship award. He was presented with it by Baroness Tanny Gray Thompson, another Churchill Fellow and Paralympian. Quotation: "I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to undertake research around best practice of disability in the US and Canada, investigating the different systems and models. I wanted to bring my research home with the aim of improving the health and social care systems we have in the UK. My research report influenced parts of the Children and Families Act 2014 and is now held in the Parliamentary Library of the House of Commons." William Case. On loan from William Case. DIY Theatre Company's Sculptural Prop by Narissa Cargill Thompson, 2020s. This object was made as part of Salford-based DIY Theatre's promenade performance, Looking Back, Facing Forward, inviting audiences to look back at learning disability history when many people with learning disabilities lived in institutions, and look forward to the contribution people with learning disabilities are making to our futures. It ended with the lyrics, "We have a voice, the power to choose what we do and who we are." On loan from DIY Theatre. DWP Deaths Make Me Sick Shrouds by Vince Laws, 2018. The 3 shrouds on display here were created by poet, artist, performer and campaigner Vince Laws. They are part of an ongoing campaign to highlight the deaths of disabled people dealing with the Department for Work and Pensions, DWP. Vince has currently made 25 shrouds. Each one commemorates the life of a named person who died as a result of the hostile environment for disabled people created by the DWP. On loan from Vince Laws. Save the Independent Living Fund, ILF banner. Made and designed by Wadiha Ahmed and Brian Hilton, 2014. After many years of campaigning, the Direct Payments Act finally came into force in 1997, making it legal for local authorities to give disabled people money to employ their own personal assistants. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, with direct payments, the ILF, a network of centres for independent living, as well as disabled people's organisations around the UK, it felt like disabled people were finally reaching a point where the hard work and campaigning had succeeded. By mid-2010, it was clear that disabled people's right to independent living was under threat again. The Independent Living Fund, ILF, was closed to new applicants, and the coalition government announced austerity cuts to the money they would give to local authorities. This led to renewed campaigning by disabled people and disabled people's organisations. In the northwest of England, Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, GMCDP, was a leader in the campaign to reopen the ILF, lobbying MPs, bringing in support from stars of Coronation Street and campaigning on the streets of Manchester and outside Parliament. Despite this, the ILF remains closed. On loan from Disabled People's Archive. Free Our People Independence Day T-shirt, 1990s. This T-shirt was from Disabled People's Direct Action Network, DAN's, Free Our People campaign, which was about campaigning for deinstitutionalisation and for disabled people to have quality support within their own homes, within their community. During this time, I was involved in helping 2 young disabled people get out of long-term residential care and live in their homes with proper personal assistant and welfare support. One of them went on to university to do a dance degree and got married to his partner. Helping both to get their lives back was the proudest thing I have done with Dan. Sue Elsgood. On loan from Sue Elsgood. Label Jars, Not People T-shirt, 1980s. People First was set up in 1984 and has a long history of campaigning for the rights of learning disabled people. They were the first user-led organisation in the country to be run and controlled by learning disabled people. Label Jars, Not People was a slogan used by People First in the 1980s. On loan from John Lay. Not Dead Yet UK banner made and designed by Wadiha Ahmed and Brian Hilton, 2016. NDY UK is a network of disabled people in the UK who have joined a growing international alliance of disabled people. They oppose the legalised killing of terminally ill and disabled people through the removal of legal barriers and the promotion of social acceptance of voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. On loan from Not Dead Yet UK.